Welcome. So if you've been following along this week, you know that we are dealing with an arcane subject, number one. And number two, we're dealing with priests and the specific laws that apply to priests. Although I will tell you that in Deuteronomy, what is understood as typical about Deuteronomy is that laws that apply only to priests become applicable to Israelites in general. And we've also, in the Rashi, been looking very carefully. He's been using the Sifra, which is what is called a halachic midrash, to analyze these sentences. And the last time we did it, we actually, by that careful and rigorous analysis, actually wound up with some ideas that you might not have thought of if you were just reading it in a cursory kind of way. So with that, we're going to go into the screen share and to tell you how much I appreciate you participating in this and hope you're enjoying it. So we go to the share. And I'm going to ask those who are not muted to mute so that, and if they have a question, of course, to unmute. So we're going on. We're going on with the laws that apply to priests. And we were talking the last time
I don't think we said the blessing.
We didn't. Okay. Thank you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you.
Amen.
I wasn't sure, but thank you.
No, I usually mute after that. That's why I
got it. Got it. All right. Well, that's a good system. So just to tell you the context, we are talking here about a priest who was in a state of impurity and touched food that was dedicated to the altar. And we also, that process of dedicating the food to the altar goes through certain stages, and the punishment for touching, and it isn't touching, that's the part that Rashi clarifies, it's for eating, for consuming sanctified food in a state of impurity is something called karet, sometimes translated as excision. It's something that's at the hands of heaven. One can do tshuva for it. But at any rate, it basically the simple translation of karet is to be cut off, That soul is cut off from its people. That's, here we go. That soul will be cut off from before me. And Rashi analyzes that as well. So that's in the last lesson that we did. There was careful analysis about what about a person who's pure, who eats something that's impure. Not the same thing, doesn't bear the same consequences. So with that, we'll go on. Ish mizera Aharon, any man who is from the seed of Aaron, in other words, is a priest, v'hu tsarua, and is leprous, or zav, or is in a state. This has to do with a person who has a seminal flow that doesn't stop, that goes on for more than, let's say, 3 days. And that is a heavier level of impurity than simply a regular seminal emission. So this is a zav, and it takes a longer period. Once that's over, once that condition is over, this is something that actually was mentioned in Tazria Metzora, actually possibly Metzora, where they talked about the zav, and it requires also an offering at the end of that process, besides going to the mikvah and waiting a certain period of time of clean days. So anyone who's in a state of leprosy or mitzorah or azav, bakodashim lo yuchal, he shall not eat any of these sacred donations ad asher yitar, until he becomes purified, until he's in a pure state. V'hanogeh b'chol tmei nefesh, and one who is in contact with someone who is impure of soul. Okay, so we'll see what exactly that means. Rashi's going to tell us. because we know that a person can contract impurity in various different ways, and those various different ways have different levels of impurity associated with them. Or ish, or a man, asher titze mimenu, and here we're now talking about, or a man from whom is emitted shichvat zera, semen, essentially is what we're talking about. Zera is seed, shichva lishkav is to lie down. So this is known, so in other words, a seminal emission. Okay, so we've gone some from, in fact, in various stages, various different types of contracting impurity, etc., etc. So let's just go on into the Rashi now. Bechol tamei nefesh. So this is something we said we needed to explain. Any who is impure of spirit, soul, and this is bemi shenitma b'meit. We're talking about someone who was in contact with a corpse. And we know from the Parsha of Chukat that this is a very, very high level of impurity. So that's what that's referring to. So let's see. Or ish asher yiga b'chol sheretz, right? Or a man who touches b'chol sheretz, any reptile, asher yitmalo, through which he can become impure, or which is capable of rendering him impure. Or va'adam asher yitmalo, or another person who is able to render him impure, lechol tumato, regardless of, in other words, according to any kind of impurity. And we know that one can, in fact, become impure from contact with another person under certain circumstances, depending on what level of impurity they themselves are suffering from, or have. Maybe suffering is the wrong word. B'chol sheretz. So we're talking about any kind of reptile. These are defined in Parsha Shmini, Asher Yitmalo, and so it says in any reptile which is capable of rendering him impure. And that phrase here, which is capable of rendering him impure, because it sounds like a redundancy. The point about this is beshiur hara'ui litameh. Okay. In other words, the amount that is capable of rendering it impure. So it's like, I'm not sure if here, yes. We're talking about what state, how much of it, whether we're talking about consuming, whether we're talking about touching it. For me, that is not exactly clear yet. But the real issue for you to consider is that there were amounts that the rabbis discussed, various minimum amounts that would be able to render a person impure. And this is adasha. That is the size of a lentil. So they used various kinds of vegetables or fruit, the size of these things. So for example, there's something that would have to be the size of a pomegranate, which is quite large. And we know that in general, for you to become impure or to have become liable for having consumed something, this is eating now, we're talking about an olive's bulk, a kazayit. So we have that as a minimum amount, so that what we're saying on a practical level is that, let's suppose we're talking about the famous situation of consuming, let's say, pork, okay? That in order to actually become, so to speak, legally liable, you have to have consumed at least that amount, the size of an olive. In some cases, it's any amount whatsoever. But in some cases, it has to do with a minimum size. So what if you ate less than an olive size of pork? It's not permitted. It just is that you don't become legally liable. And so, for example, if you were supposed to bring an offering or something like that, in terms of whatever kind of acts of repentance you had to do, you would not be liable for those things. Again, doesn't mean it's permissible. Doesn't mean it's okay to eat less than an olive size of pork. It just means you're not, in that sense, legally liable. And then another question arises, which is, do suppose you have one type of, let's say, a less than an olive of bacon and less than an olive size of ham? Do those two amounts combine? If they combine to make the size of an olive, do you in fact become liable for that? So I realize this is sort of, again, this is the kind of thing that sometimes drives people crazy. But again, if you really love something, then the details become important. So here, O ba'adam. Yes,
Rabbi, I don't think you did the Rashi for verse 4.
Go back.
You read verse 4 and then verse 5 without doing the Rashi for verse 4 because the sentence went on.
Really, I see b'chol tamei nefesh b'mi shenitma b'amed, referring to someone who became impure through the contact of a corpse. Now
I've got 3 Rashis for verse 4.
Let me look. This is where it goes on. Look at that. Do you see? Mine just goes on there. If you want to read it, that's fine. But that's all I have here in my text.
My first one is talking about Mizera Aharon. The second one is Ad Asher Yitaher, or whatever.
Yes.
And the third one is B'chol Tamei Nefesh.
So my text, for whatever the reason, doesn't have it. So if you want to read yours, go ahead and read it. I don't. I simply don't have it here. This is what I've got.
I'll just read it in English, if that's okay.
Please. Yes.
The first Rashi, among Aaron's offspring, which it said any man among Aaron, and you mentioned that was priest.
Right.
It says, I know only that Aaron's offspring, and then parentheses are meant. How do I know that he himself and every other Cohen is included?
Yes.
Scripture states, and again parentheses, the apparently superfluous word "the" in the clause. If he has tazarat, for one might think that since he is allowed to offer up holy sacrifices when he's an onen, he would also be allowed to offer them up if he has tzarat, if he had a discharge.
Yes.
Scripture therefore says, if he include Aaron and all other Kohanim. So that's the first one.
Okay, so let me explain that a little bit. Because it says of the seed of Aaron, we might want to take that very literally, meaning only the seed of Aaron and not Aaron himself. And this is the and he, the who. That's what they're saying. So that's how they know that it refers. First of all, this is why they're even asking the question, because it says any person who is of the seed of Aaron. Okay, and it says and the reason why we question whether, in other words, the high priest, and that's what we're talking about, is that the high priest can be in a state he could have lost an immediate member of his family, for which that's being in the state of aninut, being an onen. And since there's that exception for the high priest there, we might think that these are other exceptions that apply. And that's the vahu here that tells you no, while it may be true that the priest is treated, the high priest, that is treated as an exceptional case when it comes to being in that state of aninut, it doesn't apply beyond that. So that's I know it's a mouthful, but that's basically what that Rashi is talking about. But again, I did not have it here. I don't.
Can I go on to the next one?
Yes, at this point you can. I just felt
explain it. It involves that he can't eat holy stuff until he cleans himself after tzarat or a discharge.
Right.
And so the Rashi on until he cleanses himself, it says this means sunset after his immersion, or perhaps it means only immersion in a mikveh, and that suffices. It says here, vitaher, and it says below in verse 7, vitaher, when the sun has set, he becomes clean.
Yes.
Just as there in verse 7 it means sunset, here too it means sunset, that he may not eat holy things until the sun sets after his immersion.
Yes, right. So this is this particular Torah Tmima that I was going to do with you. Yeah. Okay. Yes. All right. So that's good point. We will go into that. I'm not going to comment further on that right now, but that's a very early piece of Talmud from the very first tractate of Brachot, and we'll deal with that in just a little bit, possibly tomorrow if we don't have time today. Okay, thank you. As you can see, it's just out of my. It's not in my text at all. Okay, let's go on. Okay, let's see. Right, here we go. So going on with verse 5, O ba'adam. So in this case, I just want to point this out. So this is this bechol tmei nefesh, right? This is referring to someone who has become impure through their contact with the dead, and their level of impurity is able to pass on that level of impurity to another person. What it is that we have degrees of impurity, and so this person may be considered what is called an av hatuma, and if someone else comes in contact with that person, direct physical contact, I believe we're talking about, although there are situations where it doesn't involve direct physical contact, that person is a first degree tuma. So that's talking about the person who has come in contact with a corpse. This one here, okay, ba'adam, or with a person, Rashi tells us b'meit, that is if they come in contact with the corpse itself. Asher yitmalo. And again, remember this phrase, which is able to render him impure. Again, it's meaning that amount. Kishi'uro l'tameh vezehu kazayit. In other words, this has to do with the amount that is capable of rendering one impure, and that is an olive's bulk, kazayit. Lechol tumato, according to any kind of impurity. Lerabot nogea bezav, this is to include one who is in contact, nogea, to touch, bezav, with a male zav, vezava, or a female zav, nida, a woman who's in menses, veyoledet, and a one who has just given birth. So this includes all those as well. Let's take a look here. Okay, we've got another verse to do here. A couple of verses. Nefesh asher tigabo, right? The soul which is in contact with it, the tam'a ad ha'arev, is impure until evening. Basically, it means nightfall. V'lo yochal min hakodashim, he shall not eat from the sacred foods. Now, it's interesting that it doesn't say v'lo yochal kodashim, it says lo yochal min hakodashim. And min, from, is the partitive article, and it implies that it's of, because it's of the sacred foods, it doesn't mean all of them. So we'll see. Ki im rachatz besaro mamayim, unless he has washed himself in water, washed his flesh in water. And that is understood as going to the mikveh. That is understood, this washing here is a ritual washing, and is understood as meaning immersing, being immersed in the mikveh. Let's take a look at the vav here. Nefesh asher tigabo, the soul which comes in contact with him or with it, right? Be'achad min hatmeim halalu. It's referring, Rashi says, we're talking about any one of these particular people, individuals who are in a state of impurity. There are certain, as I said, there are very high levels of impurity which if a person contracts them, he or she can then render someone else impure. So just there. Okay. Let's see if we can do, yeah, this is Zion. So I want to go on to the next word. Here we go. Uva hashemesh vetaher. So this sentence is ambiguous. Literally, it means, and the sun has come and he is pure, and he's rendered pure. So he's immersed himself, and now it's the sun has come and he is pure. And what exactly do we mean by when the sun has come? Right? We're going to have to figure that one out. V'achar yochal min hakodashim. And at that point, he can eat from the sacred food. Ki lachmohu, for this is his food. This is his food. So this little verse here is actually subject to some very interesting, I believe, some very interesting interpretations, and I will discuss that. Let's see. Let me do the Rashi for this, and then tomorrow morning, I'm hoping we'll be able to go delve even further into this verse. And as a matter of fact, well, I'll save that for tomorrow. And after that, he may eat of the sacred food. And this is in Yevamot 74. And Rashi actually says, Nidrash b'Yevamot. This is interpreted and expounded in the tractate Yevamot, Betruma, that this is referring to Truma. What is Truma? Truma was basically the first kind of tithe. It's a gift that was given to priests so that when the farmer harvested his grain, for example, he had to take, after he had taken his grain to the silo and smoothed out the grain and basically got it in a point where it was ready to take to market, he had to take 1/50th approximately of it, 152%, in other words, and separate that as truma and give it to a priest. This had a very low level of holiness to it. This is sanctified food, and the priest had to eat it in a state of holiness, just like we're reading about now. If you were a non-priest, you were forbidden to eat it. This was only to be given to the priest, and this is truma. Shemutar, and this is the point about this is that with regards to truma, even though it's sanctified food, shemutar le'achla baharev shemesh, that he is allowed to eat it when the sun comes down, at nightfall. Point about this is that not this specifically truma, the priest was allowed to eat it even if he was in a process of becoming pure. Remember, we're talking about priests who have become impure, and there are various types of impurity. And we know that some types of impurity require waiting for 7 days, and then immersing in the mikveh on the 8th day, and then waiting until nightfall, and then the next day bringing an offering. And it's only after bringing the offering that one has completed the process of becoming pure. This is what we're saying here, is that because it says min hakodashim, of the sanctified food, and that he can eat it at nightfall, is that we're saying that when it comes to truma, in other words, one of the sacred foods, not any sacred food, but this specific type of level of sanctity, that even if the priest were in the process of becoming purified from a level of purity where he needed to bring a sacrifice the next day, right? That if he had gone to the mikveh that morning, as in the part of the process, he could wait until nightfall of that day. And even if he had not yet entirely completed his process of purification, he could eat truma, because that was his food. It was sustenance. This is such an amazing example of circumstances alter cases. So I could really add this to the list of oral Torah that we find in written Torah. So just to finish this Rashi for today, min hakodashim. So the fact that it says of the sacred food, the point is velo kol hakodashim. That doesn't mean all the sacred foods. It just means this particular one. So in other words, a sacred food that is on a very primary level of sanctity, which might also apply to Ma'asar, to a tithe that was going to the priest, the part of the tithe, let's say that the Levites also had to tithe, and that the tithe of the tithe, or possibly Bechorot. Remember, the priest was given the firstborn of the new lambing, etc. These were all considered sanctified food on a certain level. Now, this Rashi says it only applies to truma, and I may be extrapolating more than I have a right to, but I'm trying to give you a level of understanding of how we approach this kind of thing traditionally in this very, very careful kind of way. And with that, I am going to stop the share, and let me mark in where we want to go. So I want to actually start tomorrow with this Torah Tamima. That's where I want to start. So I'm going to bookmark this. Oops, sorry. Okay, see if I can do this. Yeah, all right, there it is. Stop the share. All right. Okay. Before I stop the recording, are there any comments that you want to
I
make?
have a question or a comment.
Sure.
And it's kind of spurred by my reading ahead to the next verse, but it would apply to what we've already been studying.
Yes, okay.
So the next verse talks about he could become impure by eating treif. Okay, so why is it giving these rules to the priests specifically if these rules apply to all of us?
It's a good question, and I don't know that I think I want to meditate on it further. My thought, okay, excuse me 1 second. Sorry. Please excuse me. So I think, first of all, because of the context in which it is, because it's talking about thanks, because it's talking about priests and the context of priests, that's why it's talking about it. All right. And also remember, priests tend to be involved in handling sacred objects more than the average person. So this is Leviticus. We are talking about priests, and that's why it's doing it there. Now, I think one can take it a step further, and that has to do with the idea that every one of us is a temple, that we each symbolically can, and perhaps more than symbolically, are temples. A Beit HaMikdash, we're all sacred houses. And for that reason, it's taken that the Torah would like us to be able to see the significance of us acting in this holy kind of way. And in that even though we ourselves, if you're not a Cohen or not a Levite, but certainly a Cohen in this particular case, don't handle those kinds of things and don't perform the services of priests, that nevertheless, there's tremendous significance, because the whole point about it is to act, each one of us has that ability and that responsibility to try and draw down the divine into this world. And that brings it home, the fact that we're saying these laws apply to the priests on a very practical level, and by extension, where it does apply to us, we should do it. There were people I know that, again, having read along some of the traditional material, there were people who chose to eat regular food in a state of purity, so that even though they weren't priests, they also were concerned about trying to be in a state of purity when they ate just even regular food. I hope this is helping you.
Well, one difference between priests then and Kohanim or Leviim now is that many of the ones now didn't grow up having any single awareness of even the basic laws, much less, specific priestly laws.
Right. Well, this is, Talmud Torah keneged kulam. If you never crack open a Torah to study it, you're in, that's exactly what happens. So, I mean, even back in the Talmud, they're talking about the fact that every day a voice goes out crying about the fact that the Torah is being neglected. So if they were neglecting it, 2,000 years ago or more, why are we surprised if they're neglecting it now? It's in a way, that's the pathos of being Jewish, you could say. And I'm going to stop the recording with this.